Kelly, thanks for being here today. Today we're going to have a conversation about Safe Sanctuaries guidelines and policies, and also a little bit about procedures. So I have a few questions, and we're going to start off with one that is very basic.
Okay.
What basic standards should leaders consider when writing their guidelines and policies for Safe Sanctuaries?
Well, you have to start with the minimum standards that are set forth in the Safe Sanctuary book, because those are basically the standards of the industry, and you can't pick and choose which ones you choose to develop in your policy. Right. So within that, you need to have definitions defining who it is the policy covers, both as far as those in ministry and those who are being ministered to, meaning the definitions of child and youth and vulnerable adults, definition of what staff or what leaders are covered in this policy. And then from there, you have to talk about screening, what it is exactly you do for screening, how often, what's included as far as what information do you gather in your screening process. Do you require a background check? You should require a background check, and how often that background check is done. That is the one area that a lot of churches choose to pick and choose from, and it's really not an either or, it's both.
Right.
It's both. It's the collection of the disclosure information that you collect and the background screening that you do on that. So screening definitions, timelines are really important to include in that policy. Then from there is supervision. What does supervision look like in your ministry setting? That is the two-adult, non-related, non-cohabitating rule. You talk about your open door policy. You talk about ratios of supervision. Things like that are all covered in the supervision part of your policy. From there, you talk about training. What's included in your training, how often you're training, and how do you accomplish ongoing training? Because it's super important to know that with Safe Sanctuaries, it's not a one and done. You just do one background check and one training and you're good to go for all of your ministry career.
I don't think
it
so.
should be continual and it should be consistent.
Right.
And so establishing what that looks like in your policy is really important. What is also really important to talk about is reporting. How it is you report, because you have local and state agencies that have a protocol, which usually have time limits on them, that have specific information that needs to be collected. It's also a place for you to talk about what is your responsibility as a mandated reporter and what is not your responsibility as a mandated reporter. What happens to the accused, what happens to the victim as far as their interaction and involvement in the church during a reporting incident occurrence. From there, you also have to have a response plan. You need a crisis plan. You don't want to be thinking about roles and responsibility and who needs to be doing what while it's happening. Right. So your response plan would talk about what's the chain of command, who's giving out information, who's informing parents, who's talking to the media. What are some support systems that you can bring in for the other staff that might need support or counseling through this? The pastor themselves who is dealing with this situation in their congregation. Who's dealing with the state agencies that need to be involved in these kind of incidents. And your conference will probably have a very specific information around crisis, and dealing with your conference communication person is a real important connection to have in your response plan, because most conferences request that upon an incident such as child abuse, that you immediately contact your conference office and allow their communication department, who are trained professionals, to help you in your response to a reported incident.
Wonderful. It's a lot to think about, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And to make sure that you have in place. And like you said, if something comes up, it's better to plan and have it in place before there is an emergency, which could absolutely happen.
Absolutely.
So how do leaders best apply Safe Sanctuaries guidelines?
So the best way to apply it is you never just write it and throw it in a drawer, because basically you are telling the world at large, this is how how we do things around here.
Right.
This is how we live into our ministry. And so once the policy is created, then you really need to put the policy or guidelines you've written against the reality of the ministries you do in the church. Because sometimes it's not just a Sunday school youth group situation. You have a community daycare program or a parents' night out. You have a unique ministry within your program and within your church that you really need to know how to apply those guidelines and those policies. And sometimes an adaptation needs to be made, or things need to be changed, or sometimes even eliminated. Once you've established your guideline or policy, it's really, really important that you then kind of walk through everything you do in the church and how do you apply this to how you do ministry. Once you've made those decisions and made those adaptations or changes as necessary, then that needs to be shared with the congregation on an ongoing basis so people understand this is why we do this now. It's because we care about our young people, we care about our vulnerable adults, and we care about the staff and volunteers who minister to them. And so therefore, this is how we are applying our policy, our guidelines to our ministry, which is the best thing for all.
And one of the steps that you brought up that I think is so important and we forget about is the walkthrough.
Yeah.
Knowing your facility, knowing your ministries, and seeing how does that play out in this space.
Yeah,
so important.
People all the time will say, well, we don't have windows on our doors and we don't always have 2 adults in a Sunday school room. What do we do? And so, you know, churches have come up with really inventive things like having a rover with a walkie-talkie and having active rovers to go from classroom to classrooms that have open doors, but allow that second adult or individual to be present when they have a situation that they need to adapt to conform to their guidelines and policy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So one of the things that you brought up, that sometimes congregations write Safe Sanctuaries policies and guidelines only to have them end up gathering dust, right? So how often should leaders review and update guidelines?
Well, obviously yearly, they need to be looked at, and it's a really good time to reflect on any incidents that have happened in the past year and think about, well, what could we have done different to prevent this and for this not to be a challenge in our ministry. And it's not always a reportable incident, it's just a situation that they found themselves being challenged to apply the policy and the guidelines in that ministry setting. You know, you have one youth leader and suddenly kids are being picked up from youth group, and that leaves an adult alone with a child. So they need to look at that and say, how do we prevent this from happening? What is it we can do, you know, to change it? Do we change the time of youth group so there are other people in the church and present so this adult would not be alone with a young person as people are being picked up for youth groups? So it's those kind of a review that you do. So you look at the policies, make sure that there's nothing that needs to be added. You also need to do the walkthrough of all your ministries, anything that has challenged or any incident that has come up. And you know, you also need to review it with your staff on a yearly basis in your training so that they can remember the accountability and the expectations that they have based upon the guidelines and policies that you've written.
Okay. Thank you. And how about writing and updating Safe Sanctuaries policies? We know this can be daunting and even overwhelming, especially when you're starting from the beginning. Who can congregations turn to for support and leaders turn to for support and guidance in writing these policies and guidelines?
There are so many places you can turn to. I mean, you could start with the Safe Sanctuary book, which kind of gives you the framework of everything you need to know about writing policy. But beyond that, most conferences have a person who is responsible for Safe Sanctuaries policies. Most of our conferences have a Safe Sanctuary policy at the conference level that you could probably use as a sample. Discipleship Ministries has a whole page that has resources and sample documents for you to go to. And then there's, of course, you and I, who that is, you know, part of our ministry is to be a resource and to be a support for those as they live into Safe Sanctuaries in their ministry settings. And so there are people like you and I who you can contact and say, and we get those emails all the time.
Yeah,
we're writing our policy and we suddenly realize that we have an on-site preschool. How does this apply to our on-site preschool? And these are our questions that we have. So there are many resources out there through the Discipleship Ministries, through your conference, staff and resources, as well as just the Safe Sanctuaries handbook that was written as a foundation for the whole process.
Yeah, there are lots of them, for sure. Okay, and our last question, what particular group of people in the congregation and community need to be knowledgeable of Safe Sanctuaries guidelines and procedures?
Everyone, everybody, because it's really funny that if you only train your Sunday school volunteers and your staff and your youth workers, and they're operating in a certain way, and then suddenly you have parent chaperones that don't have the understanding or the training, and suddenly they're doing things that are outside your guidelines because they didn't have the information. And I think that most congregations welcome the opportunity to know how much we care about our young people by saying this is how we are ministry. We love our children and we love the adults who are willing to work with our children. And because of that, we have created these guidelines, we've created these policies that we are all in agreement that when we're in ministry, this is how we operate. This is the covenant we have in ministry for protection for everyone involved in the ministry. And so, as I've talked about before, there are a lot of churches that make that information public through their bulletins or through their screens at church. Other times, I've seen it done at coffee hour or fellowship hours. They have short, informational sessions on Safe Sanctuaries. So it's just not this small little group of people who are in the know of what needs to be done within the ministry setting.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And I love that we said everyone together. Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Safe Sanctuaries is a way that we live into our baptismal covenant, truly.
Absolutely.
So it's very important that everybody's a part of that covenant. Well, thank you, Kelly. It's been nice chatting with you, and I just enjoy working with you, and you're just a blessing to the church.
And you are as well.
Thanks.